Texas, 1945. Spring. The girl's hands were wrapped in gauze, so white it hurt to look at. She sat in the corner of the base hospital ward, 17 years old, blonde hair chopped short like a boy's, eyes fixed on a linoleum floor that reflected nothing. Her skin had been burned, not by fire by cold. Frostbite from a transport ship's cargo hold, 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic in February darkness. Metal walls sweating ice, no blankets, 40 women pressed together trying to survive. When the medics unwrapped her fingers that first morning at Fort Sam Houston, the smell made 2 of them step outside. But they came back. They always came back. The transport arrived on a Tuesday morning when the sky hung low and gray. Nobody expected women. The telegram said German prisoners, military auxiliaries, captured during the collapse in Belgium during the winter offensive. The base commander assumed soldiers' Luftwaffe ground crew, perhaps, or Wehrmacht communication staff. Instead, the trucks rolled through the gate carrying girls. Some 16, some 25. All wearing the same gray wool uniforms, all silent, all staring at the Texas sky like it was painted on glass and might shatter if they looked too hard. Lisa Hartman was among them. Auxiliary nurse, Eastern Front, captured near Bastogne when her field hospital overflowed with wounded, and the American Third Army surrounded them in the snow. She'd spent 6 months in a Belgian holding facility before the transfer orders came through the military bureaucracy. America. The word meant nothing to her except what the propaganda had promised. In Germany, America was Hollywood films and gangsters, and endless wealth built on exploitation. The propaganda posters showed Uncle Sam with bloody hands, standing over piles of German children. She believed some of it, enough to be afraid. The base was enormous. Endless rows of white wooden barracks stretching toward horizons that seemed impossible. Parade grounds wider than village squares back home. Trucks and jeeps moving in organized patterns that seemed choreographed. Heat shimmered off the concrete even in early spring. The air tasted like dust and something green mesquite, she'd learn later, though the word meant nothing yet. A sergeant with a clipboard checked names, mispronouncing all of them, then pointed toward the women's detention compound. Barbed wire, but not much. Guard towers, but the men inside were reading newspapers, and smoking cigarettes like this was just another boring duty assignment. "You'll be assigned work details tomorrow," the sergeant said in slow English, as if volume could translate meaning. Medical examination first, then orientation, and barracks assignment. Lisa understood none of it, but she followed the line of gray uniforms toward the low building, marked with a red cross, her wrapped hands held carefully against her stomach, and tried not to think about what medical examination meant in a country that hated her. The other women walked in silence. Fear had a smell, Lisa had learned, salt and something metallic. The air around them was thick with it. The medical building was clean. That was the first shock. Spotless white walls, bright fluorescent lights, the sharp smell of disinfectant. In Belgium, the holding facility had been a converted warehouse with dirt floors and buckets for latrines. Here, everything gleamed. American efficiency, Lisa thought. Even their prison camps were organized like factories. They were processed one by one. Height, weight, visual examination for obvious injuries or diseases. Most of the women were malnourished, but otherwise healthy. Thin, exhausted, bearing the marks of long transport and longer war, but functional. The American doctors worked quickly, professionally, marking notes on clipboards. No cruelty. No particular kindness either. Just procedure. Then they got to Lisa. The medic's name was Danny Reeves. 22 years old, from a town in Oklahoma so small it didn't have a movie theater or a proper main street. Drafted in '43, trained as a combat medic, then reassigned stateside when his hearing failed the deployment. Physical childhood fever had damaged his left ear, left him with permanent ringing that disqualified him from frontline service. He'd been angry about it for months, felt like he was hiding while his friends died in France and Germany and the Pacific. Felt like a coward, even though logic told him otherwise. Then the first transport of wounded arrived at Fort Sam Houston. Boys with faces blown off and legs missing and eyes that stared at nothing, and he stopped feeling angry. There was enough suffering right here. He was checking supplies in the ward when they brought the German girls through for examination. Standard procedure: check for contagious diseases, document injuries, assign treatment protocols if necessary. He watched them file past young women in warm uniforms, faces blank with exhaustion and fear. Most looked like they needed a good meal and a week of sleep, standard transport conditions. Then he saw Lisa's hands. The gauze was brown with seepage, old blood and fluid staining the fabric. Old bandages, applied weeks ago, never changed. When the supervising doctor gestured for her to show her hands, she extended them slowly, like someone presenting evidence of a crime. The doctor, Captain Morrison, tired eyes and graying hair, started to unwrap the first layer. The fabric stuck to skin. Lisa made a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire. No tears, no crying out. Just that small, trapped sound of pain so familiar it had become background noise. Danny stepped closer. Morrison pulled away more gauze, and Danny saw the damage underneath. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The frostbite had progressed to third-degree damage on 3 fingers of her left hand, second degree across both palms. The tissue was necrotic in places, infected, the skin mottled purple and gray, and black in spots where the flesh had simply died. She must have been in constant pain for weeks. Months, maybe. He looked at her face, blank, distant, eyes focused somewhere past Morrison's shoulder at something invisible, and wondered what kind of medical care she'd received during transport, or if she'd received any at all. "We need to treat this immediately," Danny said to Morrison. "She could lose these fingers. Maybe the whole hand if the infection spreads." Morrison looked, nodded slowly. "Clean it thoroughly, debride all the dead tissue, apply sulfa powder and fresh dressings. Keep her here for observation. Monitor for signs of sepsis." He paused, studying Lisa's face. "She speak English?" "I don't think so, sir." "Well, do your best to communicate. She's going to need to understand the treatment protocol." Morrison moved on to the next prisoner. Danny gathered supplies: surgical scissors, tweezers, antiseptic solution, clean gauze, sulfa drugs that were still relatively new, but showing miraculous results against infection. Lisa watched him with the expression of someone who'd stopped expecting mercy a long time ago. When he approached with the scissors to cut away the old bandages, she flinched but didn't pull away. Like she'd learned that resistance only made things worse. Like she'd learned to endure. He worked slowly. The old gauze came off in pieces, taking bits of dead skin with it. She shook not from fear, he realized, but from pain so intense her body couldn't stay still. A fine tremor that started in her shoulders and ran down through her arms to her damaged hands. He kept talking, soft and steady, though he knew she didn't understand the words. Tone mattered sometimes more than language. "Doing real good, almost through the worst part. You're real brave, you know that? Braver than most soldiers I've treated. Just hang on a little longer." When the last bandage came free, he soaked her hands in warm antiseptic solution. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and tears finally came, silent, steady, carving clean lines through the dust on her face. Danny worked carefully, debriding the necrotic tissue with tweezers, cleaning each finger, each crack in her palms where the skin had split from the cold and then frozen that way. The process took 40 minutes. She never pulled away, never cried out, just sat there shaking, tears falling, breathing through her nose in short, controlled bursts. Finally, he applied the sulfa powder miracle stuff that fought infection better than anything they'd had before the war, and wrapped her hands in clean white gauze. loose enough not to constrict the swelling, tight enough to protect the damaged tissue underneath. When he finished, he held her hands gently, checking his work, making sure the bandages would hold. "There," he said. "That's better, isn't it?" She looked at her hands like she was seeing them for the first time, then at him, then back at her hands. Her lips moved, forming words in German he couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. Confusion, maybe gratitude, maybe disbelief that someone would spend 40 minutes treating her wounds with such care. He smiled. "You're gonna be okay. These'll heal up fine if we keep them clean." She didn't smile back, but something shifted in her eyes, a crack in the glass, a flicker of something that might have been hope. That evening, Danny sat in the medic's barracks and tried to write a letter to his mother. "Dear Mom, got some German prisoners in today. Women, which nobody expected. The telegram said military auxiliaries, but most of them looked like they'd been pulled straight from civilian life and put in uniforms. Young girls mostly, scared and exhausted. One of them had frostbite, so bad I thought she might lose her fingers. Took me over an hour to clean and dress the wounds properly. The tissue was necrotic in places, infected, clearly hadn't been treated properly for weeks, maybe months. She didn't cry until I was almost done, and even then it was quiet. Makes you wonder what they went through to get here. Makes you wonder what kind of doctors they had over there that let something like that go untreated for so long. I know they're the enemy. I know what Germany did, what the regime ordered, all the terrible things we've heard about. But she's just a girl, Mom, younger than Sarah, maybe the same age. And her hands were a mess, and nobody had helped her, and I couldn't just let that go. Does that make sense? Sometimes I think this war has scrambled my brain, made it hard to tell who's who and what matters. But then I think about those hands and how much pain she must have been in, and I know I did the right thing." He stopped writing, stared at the words. They looked naive on paper, simplistic, like something a child would write. The world wasn't that simple. The enemy was the enemy. Germany had started this war, had killed millions, had done things so terrible the full scope of it was only now becoming clear as Allied forces, liberated camps and documented atrocities. You couldn't just ignore that because one girl had frostbitten hands, but you couldn't ignore the hands either. Danny folded the letter and put it in his footlocker, unmailed. Some things were too complicated to explain, even to your mother. Lisa returned to the detention compound after dark, escorted by an MP who looked bored. The other women crowded around her immediately, speaking rapid German, asking questions she answered in fragments. The American medic had been kind, unexpectedly kind. The treatment had hurt God. It had hurt worse than anything except the original freezing, but not like punishment, not like cruelty. They'd given her new bandages, real medicine, treated her like a patient instead of an enemy combatant. She showed them her wrapped hands, the clean white gauze that seemed to glow in the dim light of the barracks. "They're trying to win us over," Marguerite said. She was older, maybe 30, a communications officer who'd been captured in France. Sharp eyes, suspicious mind. Propaganda. Show the world they treat prisoners humanely, especially women. Makes them look civilized. Maybe, Lisa said. But she remembered the medic's face young, tired, focused completely on her hands, like nothing else in the world mattered in that moment. The careful way he'd worked, talking softly even though she couldn't understand. That wasn't propaganda. That was something else, something human. She lay in her bunk that night, hands resting carefully on her stomach, and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, she could see stars. More stars than she'd ever seen in Germany, where blackout regulations kept cities dark, and the war painted the sky with searchlights and bomber trails. Here the sky was enormous, scattered with light, indifferent to borders and wars, the small human dramas playing out beneath it. The universe didn't care about Germany or America, victory or defeat. It just existed, vast and cold and beautiful. Her skin hurt, but differently now. Like healing, which was a kind of pain she'd almost forgotten existed. Danny changed her dressings every morning for a week. The routine became familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. She'd arrive at the ward at 800 sharp, accompanied by an MP who'd wait by the door reading a magazine. She'd sit in the same chair by the window, where light streamed through bright and warm. Hold out her hands without being asked. He'd unwrap the old gauze carefully, checking for signs of infection, examining each finger for changes in color or temperature. Clean the wounds with antiseptic that made her hiss through her teeth but never pull away. Apply fresh sulfa powder. Rewrap with clean bandages. The whole process took 30 minutes. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't share a language beyond gestures and tone, but silence became its own communication. A shared understanding that this time, this routine, mattered. By the third day, the infection had started to clear. The angry red lines radiating from the wounds had faded. The swelling had gone down. The tissue was beginning to pink up underneath the damaged layers, new skin growing slow but steady. On the fourth day, she said something in German while he was cleaning her left palm. He looked up. "Sorry, don't understand." She tried again, slower, but the words meant nothing to him. Frustration crossed her face, the first real emotion he'd seen, besides pain. She frowned, bit her lip, then pointed to her hands and made a gesture like rapping, like she was mimicking his movements. "Oh, you want to know how to do this yourself?" She stared at him, waiting. He showed her, step by step, how to unroll the gauze without contaminating it, how to wrap each finger individually, starting at the tip and working down to the base, how to secure the palm wrapping without cutting off circulation, how to tie off the end so it wouldn't unravel. She watched intently, memorizing every movement, her eyes tracking his hands with professional focus. When he finished, he carefully unwrapped one hand and gestured for her to try. She did. Awkward at first, the damaged fingers didn't bend properly yet, and her motor control was still compromised, but careful, precise, methodical. She'd been trained in medical care. He realized she knew what she was doing. Just needed to see the specific technique, the American method. "That's real good," he said, smiling. "You're a natural. Better than some of the medics here, if I'm being honest." She looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled back. Small, tentative, gone almost immediately like a bird, landing and taking flight in the same breath. But real, genuine. A crack in the armor she'd built around herself. By the end of the second week, the infection had cleared completely. Lisa's fingers were healing ahead of schedule. The purple-gray tissue had given way to pink, new skin growing beneath the damaged layers like spring grass pushing through winter's dead covering. She'd regained full function, Morrison predicted during his inspection, though the scars would be permanent. Tissue damage that's severe always left marks. But she'd be able to use her hands normally. Write, work, whatever she needed. Danny considered this a victory worth celebrating, though he kept his satisfaction private. The day Morrison officially cleared her from daily treatment, requiring only weekly check-ins, Lisa looked almost disappointed when Danny told her. "You'll be okay now," he said, miming okay with his hands, fingers spread to show health and function. "Healed. Better. Just keep them clean and dry." She nodded slowly. Then, in careful, heavily accented English that surprised him completely. "Thank you." He blinked. "You speak English?" "Little." She held her thumb and forefinger close together, demonstrating a small amount. "Learn. In school. Before war. Not good, but some." "Well," he grinned, delighted by this revelation. "Your English is a hell of a lot better than my German." "Which is none at all." She smiled again, less tentative this time. The expression made her look younger, closer to her actual age, instead of the worn-down adult exhaustion that usually shadowed her features. Then she said something that made him stop grinning, that made him understand why she'd been so quiet for 2 weeks. In Germany, they tell us Americans are cruel, like animals. They say, if captured, Americans will hurt us very bad. Torture. Kill, maybe. I think, when ship comes here, I think they will let my hands become more bad. Die. Punishment for being German. But you help. You are kind. I do not understand why. Danny didn't know what to say to that. The propaganda ran both ways, he knew. Americans were told Germans were monsters, inhuman, driven by ideology that made them fundamentally different from normal people. Germans were told Americans were savages, money-grubbing warmongers who destroy Germany for profit. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle, complicated, human, full of contradictions and individual choices that defied easy categorization. But right now, standing in this bright Texas hospital ward with a German girl whose hands he'd saved, whose life he'd probably saved, because that infection could have gone septic, the truth felt simpler than all the propaganda. Because you needed help, he said finally. That's what medics do. We help people who need it. Doesn't matter what uniform they're wearing or which side they fought on. Pain is pain. Suffering is suffering. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then, I think this is a good answer. I think maybe this is why America will win. Not just bombs or soldiers. Because you still see people as people. Lisa was assigned to work in the base laundry the following Monday. Standard procedure for female prisoners' domestic duties. Supervised, but relatively unrestricted within the base compound. The laundry was a long, low building that smelled like soap, and steam and hot cotton, enormous washing machines churning constantly, long tables for folding stretching the length of the room. The work was tedious, but not difficult, repetitive, mind-numbing, but Lisa was good with her hands, even damaged ones still learning to bend properly, and she found rhythm in the folding. Sheets, towels, uniforms. Fold, stack, repeat. The American women who worked there, civilian employees, local residents hired to manage the facility and supervise the prisoner workers, treated the German women with wary politeness. Not cruel, but not friendly either. Distance maintained through careful neutrality. Lisa understood. These women had sons and husbands and brothers, fighting overseas, fighting Germans, maybe guying to German bullets and German artillery. The enemy wore a gray uniform and spoke German, and no amount of folding sheets together in a steamy Texas laundry could erase that fundamental division. But there were small kindnesses that appeared like flowers through concrete cracks. Maria, the head laundress, was 50-something with iron-gray hair and hands roughened by decades of work. She showed Lisa how to operate the industrial presses without burning herself, demonstrated the timing and pressure needed, brought her cold water on especially hot days when the temperature inside the laundry climbed past 100 degrees and the air felt too thick to breathe. Once, when Lisa's hands cramped from the repetitive work, tendons still healing from the frostbite damage, Maria gave her a pair of thin cotton gloves to wear. "You take care with those," Maria said in slow, clear English. "Hands still healing, yes? Don't want to damage them more." Lisa nodded. "Thank you. Very kind. You speak English good. Where you learn? School?" "Before war." Lisa paused, choosing words carefully from her limited vocabulary. "I want to be teacher. Teach children. English and German. After war, maybe. If possible." Maria studied her, this thin girl in a gray uniform, blonde hair growing out awkward from the prison cut, hands wrapped in white bandages that were slowly becoming unnecessary. Maybe she saw something that reminded her of her own daughter, who taught at an elementary school in San Antonio. Maybe she just saw another young woman whose life had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control, swept up in history's current. Maybe, Maria said. War don't last forever. Nothing does. Spring turned to summer, and the heat arrived like an invading army. The temperature in Texas was different from anything Lisa had experienced in Northern Europe. Dry, relentless, the kind of heat that baked the ground hard and turned the sky white at noon, that made the air shimmer and warp like you were looking through water. She learned to work slowly in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the brutal midday hours when even the guards retreated to shade. She learned to drink water constantly, more than she thought she needed, because dehydration hit fast in this climate. The other German women did the same. They were adapting, learning the rhythms of this strange landscape. Danny still saw her occasionally. She'd come to the ward for follow-up examinations every Friday, and they'd talk brief conversations in her steadily improving English, his still non-existent German. He learned she'd been a student before the war. Nursing school in Hamburg, second year, when the bombing started. Her father had been a teacher at a gymnasium, killed in an air raid in '43 when a bomb took out his school during class hours. Her mother and younger sister evacuated to the countryside after that, family friends in a village near Bremen, whereabouts currently unknown. Communication with Germany was impossible. She had no idea if they were alive or dead. She joined the medical auxiliaries, because it was that or factory work, and at least nursing felt like helping people. Like doing something meaningful in a world gone mad. You were helping people, Danny said during one of these Friday conversations. Even if you were on the wrong side of this war, you were still helping wounded soldiers survive. That counts for something. Wrong side. She tested the words, rolling them in her mouth like something bitter. Yes, I understand this now. But at the time, I did not know. We did not know. They did not tell us. Propaganda told us many things. Different things than truth. Same here. We were told you were all monsters. Every German, every person in uniform. Monsters who wanted to destroy the world. Are we? She looked at him directly, a challenge in her eyes. Are we monsters? He looked back at her, this girl who'd endured pain without complaint, who worked hard in the laundry, who smiled tentatively at kindness, like she'd forgotten it existed, who was learning English phrases and asking about American customs and trying to understand a world that had labeled her an enemy. No, you're just people. People who got caught up in something bigger than themselves. People who made choices, good and bad, in impossible circumstances. Just people. She was quiet for a long moment, digesting this. Then, in the beginning, on the ship crossing the ocean, when my hands were very bad, and the pain was so much I could not sleep, I thought the Americans would not help. I thought they would look at my hands and see German enemy, and they would let me lose my fingers. Let them fall off. Punishment for being on wrong side. But you helped. You spent time, you used medicine. You were gentle. Why? Danny considered the question. The real answer was complicated medical training, professional duty, basic human decency that transcended national boundaries. The Hippocratic oath he'd never technically taken, but felt bound by anyway through some unspoken contract with his profession. But he settled on something simpler, more direct. Because you needed help. That's enough reason. She nodded slowly, as if this answer explained something important, solved some puzzle she'd been working on. I think, she said carefully, measuring each word, this is one reason why you will win this war. Not just because you have more guns, more planes, more everything, but because you still see people as people, even enemies. That is, powerful. That defeats hate. The war in Europe ended in May, on a Tuesday that felt like any other day until it didn't. News came over the radio in the laundry, crackling announcements of Germany's unconditional surrender, the regime's leadership meeting their end, military forces laying down arms. The American women stopped working immediately. Someone turned up the volume. The announcer's voice filled the building, talking about victory in Europe, about Allied triumph, about the beginning of peace. The base erupted in celebration, outside servicemen cheering, trucks honking, someone firing a rifle into the air, until an officer screamed at them to stop and threatened disciplinary action. In the laundry, the German women continued folding sheets in silence. Lisa stood at her table, hands moving automatically through motions her muscles knew by memory now, and thought about Hamburg. About streets she'd walked as a child, now reduced to rubble according to the stories that filtered through. About her mother, who might be dead or alive or somewhere in between, impossible to know. About her sister, who'd be 19 now if she'd survived. About the millions of people, German, American, British, Russian, French, all the rest who died for reasons that felt increasingly distant and abstract the longer she thought about them. The regime had fallen. The leadership had met their end. The great ideological struggle that had consumed Europe had collapsed into dust and ash and mass graves and cities bombed flat. And here she was, alive, in Texas, hands healed, folding American army sheets in a laundry that smelled like soap. That evening, Marguerite organized a quiet gathering in the common room of their barracks. No celebration. That would have been obscene, disrespectful to everyone who died. But a moment of acknowledgement. The war was over. They'd survived. Whatever came next, repatriation, trial, uncertain futures in a defeated nation, it couldn't be worse than what had come before. "We'll be sent home eventually," Marguerite said, addressing the group of 30 women who sat on bunks and chairs and the floor. "Or to trial, depending on what they determine about our knowledge and involvement. But we're still alive. After everything, we're still breathing. Remember that." Lisa remembered something else, too. The young medic who'd treated her hands with such care. The laundress who'd given her gloves and cold water. The sergeant who taught her how to properly pronounce "good morning" when she butchered it the first dozen times. Small kindnesses from people who had every reason to hate her, who had been given permission by war and propaganda to see her as less than human, who chose something different instead. Maybe that was how you rebuilt a world after it burned down. One small kindness at a time. One choice to see people as people. In June, Danny received reassignment orders. The war was winding down in the Pacific, though Japan still fought. Troop movements were shifting, personnel being redistributed to where they'd be needed for occupation duties and veteran care, and the massive logistical operation of bringing millions of soldiers home. He was heading to California, to a veterans hospital in Los Angeles that desperately needed experienced medics for the flood of wounded coming back from the Pacific Theater. The orders came through on a Thursday. He was scheduled to ship out the following Monday. 5 days to pack up, say goodbyes, prepare for the next chapter. He saw Lisa one last time, by accident, in the base commissary on Saturday afternoon. She was with a work detail, carrying boxes of supplies from a delivery truck to the storage room. Her hands were bare, now no bandages, just thin scars across her palms and fingers, pink lines that would fade to white over time. She saw him and stopped walking, set down the box carefully. "You are leaving," she said, not a question. Somehow she knew. "Yeah, new orders. California. There's a veterans hospital in Los Angeles that needs medics. Lot of wounded coming back from the Pacific." She nodded, stood there for a moment, clearly trying to decide something. Then she extended her right hand, the one that had been damaged worst, the one he'd thought might require amputation, now healed and functional. "Thank you," she said, "for my hands, for your kindness, for showing me not all Americans are what we are told." He took her hand and shook it carefully, conscious of the still healing tissue. The scars felt rough under his palm, textured, but her grip was strong and sure. "You're welcome. Good luck, Lisa. I hope you make it home safe. I hope you find your family. Good luck, Danny. I hope you help many more people." He wanted to say something profound about humanity and healing and the strange ways war brought people together only to tear them apart again. about how he'd remember her, about how she'd taught him something about seeing past uniforms to the human beings underneath. But the words wouldn't come, tangled up in his throat, and anyway, they'd already said everything that mattered in the simplest terms possible. He left. She picked up her box and continued working. The Texas sun blazed overhead, indifferent and eternal, heating the earth toward summer. Lisa was repatriated to Germany in November 1945. The process took months' extensive paperwork, multiple interviews with military intelligence, security clearances that had to be processed through various bureaucratic channels. She was young, clearly not a war criminal, guilty of nothing more than being a nurse in the wrong uniform at the wrong time. The Americans cleared her without incident, sent her back to Germany on a transport ship, this time in decent conditions, with blankets and hot food and proper medical care. The ship docked in Hamburg as she walked down the gangplank into a city she didn't recognize. The destruction was total, apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Streets that had once been lined with shops and homes, now just cleared paths through debris. People lived in basements and cellars, scavenging for food, burning furniture for heat. The occupation forces British, mostly in this sector, maintained order with military efficiency. But the population was shell-shocked, traumatized, struggling to process what had happened and what came next. Lisa found her mother alive in a village 30 kilometers outside the city. Her sister had survived too, had actually married a British soldier she'd met during the occupation, was living in Manchester now and pregnant with her first child. The news felt surreal. 5 years of war, and her family had somehow made it through largely intact. Not unchanged, her father was still dead. They'd lost their home, their possessions, their former life, but alive. Lisa returned to nursing school. It took 2 years to complete her degree in the chaos of post-war Germany, studying in makeshift classrooms with used textbooks and limited supplies. But she finished. Spent the next 40 years working in hospitals across Germany, Hamburg, Munich, Berlin, after reunification, treating patients with the same careful attention Danny Reeves had shown her in that bright Texas ward. She never forgot the lesson those healed hands had taught her, that healing was a choice, that kindness was a choice, that even in the darkest moments of human history, individual human beings could decide to be better than their circumstances demanded. She married a teacher in 1952. They had 3 children together, raised them to believe in peace and understanding and the importance of seeing past labels to the humans underneath. She lived to see Germany reunified, to see the wall come down, to see her grandchildren grow up in a peaceful Europe that seemed impossible during those dark years when everything burned. She lived a good life, a full life, a lucky life considering. And sometimes on summer days when the heat shimmered just right and the sky stretched wide and endless, she'd look at her hands, old, now spotted with age, marked by those faint scars across the palms that never quite disappeared, and remember Texas, the dust and the wide sky and the young American medic who'd treated her like a human being when nobody else would, who'd spent 40 careful minutes cleaning her wounds and wrapping them in clean white gauze, who'd smiled and said she'd be okay. She'd whisper, in English that never quite lost its German accent, "Thank you, Danny. I was okay." Danny Reeves worked at veterans' hospitals for 30 years after the war. He treated thousands of patient soldiers, shattered by combat in Europe and the Pacific and Korea and Vietnam, minds and bodies broken by things they'd seen and done. He saved some, lost others, did his best with all of them, gave each one the same careful attention he'd given a German girl with frostbitten hands in a Texas-based hospital in 1945. He married a nurse from California in 47, raised 2 sons who both became doctors, carrying on the family tradition of healing. Never quite shook the ringing in his left ear, that permanent reminder of the childhood fever that had kept him from combat, but learned to live with it, turned it into something like a friend. He thought about Lisa sometimes over the years. wondered if she'd made it home, hoped she had, hoped her hands had healed completely, hoped she'd found whatever passed for peace in a ruined continent trying to rebuild itself. He never knew for certain. The world was too big, records too scattered and incomplete, the distance too vast. He tried once to find her, in the 70s when he was thinking about retirement, wrote to the Red Cross and the military archives, but the trail was cold. Too much time had passed, too many records lost. But sometimes he'd treat a patient with terrible injuries, burns, frostbite, wounds that should have been fatal, but somehow weren't, and he'd work with the same deliberate care he'd learned in Texas. And he'd think about her. Think about that moment when she'd extended her healed hand to shake his, when she'd thanked him in careful English. Think about what it meant that they'd both survived a war that had killed millions, that they'd found a moment of shared humanity in the middle of all that death. This is how you fight a war after the war is over, he'd think, one person at a time, one set of wounded hands, one choice to see past the uniform to the human being underneath, one choice to be kind when kindness wasn't required. The historians would note it, decades later, when the full records became available. Over 400,000 German Poles passed through American custody during World War II. The vast majority were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, adequately fed, decently housed, given medical care that met minimum requirements. Some, like Lisa Hartman, were treated with something closer to compassion. Individual acts of humanity that happened too quietly to make headlines, too small to change the war's grand outcome, but profound enough to change individual lives completely. These weren't the stories that won medals or appeared in newspapers or got turned into Hollywood films. They were the stories people carried home in their bones, in their scars, in their memories of moments when the person in front of them chose mercy instead of cruelty, understanding instead of hate. They were the stories that rebuilt trust slowly, person by person, across decades of reconciliation between former enemies. They were the stories that mattered most in the end. Texas, 1945. Spring. The girl's hands were wrapped in gauze so white it hurt to look at, but underneath, skin was healing, cells dividing, tissue regenerating, life persisting against odds and damage and every reason to give up. A medic named Danny worked carefully, gently, treating an enemy like a patient, a human being like another human being. A girl named Lisa accepted help from someone she'd been taught to fear, learned that propaganda lied, discovered that people were more complicated than ideology allowed. And somewhere in that small exchange, one human being caring for another across the vast divide of war and nationality, and everything that should have made them enemies, something shifted. The wound could heal. The scars would remain. But they'd both carry those scars forward into a world that desperately needed to remember a simple truth. Kindness was always possible, even in darkness, even in war, even when everything said it shouldn't be. Especially then,